Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, your award-winning Texas history podcast. This is your host, Ken Wise. Thank you so much for tuning in for a little bit of Texas history today. This podcast is being recorded and released in the high holy days of Texas history. So I hope you're participating in many of the events around the state commemorating the Texas Revolution. Myself, I just got back from 4 days at the Texas State Historical Association annual meeting. I'm very proud to let all my listeners know I was elected second vice president of that organization. So if things continue as normal, I'll be president in a couple of years. It's such an honor to be asked to be involved in that association. The Texas State Historical Association was organized appropriately enough on March the 2nd in the year 1897. And it has been headed by many, many wonderful people. Our current president this year will be Lance Lawley from Austin, Texas. Good friend of mine, and I'm looking forward to serving with all of the officers and to joining that group for the Texas State Historical Association. You might be most familiar with the association because of the Handbook of Texas, and now that's online. The Handbook of Texas online is where you should always start your Texas history research. It's where I start, and you will find tremendous and unmatched resources on that site. Go to tshaonline.org and enjoy all the resources of the Texas State Historical Association. So it's been a big week, and today I'm going to do a quick episode, and I'm going to follow it up with some more quick episodes on some of the Alamo defenders that you may not have heard of. And we're going to start today with a gentleman named Jose Toribio Losoya. Jose Losoya was born in 1808. He was born in the Alamo neighborhood, April 1808, as a matter of fact. The Losoya house was a two-room structure. It was made out of stone, and it had been the house of some of the mission Indians for the Alamo, but it was deeded to the Losoya family. And it was near the southwest corner of the Alamo, and I'll talk about that when we get to the getting there section. Losoya married Maria Francisca Kerbier and fathered 3 children. He was also a member of what's commonly known the Alamo de Parras Military Company. Their official name was the Second Flying Company of San Carlos de Parras. Now, let me tell you a little bit about that unit, because you hear a lot about these flying companies in Texas history, and it's sometimes confusing what they actually were. The Second Flying Company was a company of about 100 Lancers, and they had come from Mexico, from Coahuila, and this particular company came to Texas in 1803. Now, by 1803, the Alamo was no longer a mission. It had been secularized, and that's where the company took up residence. So the mission was very quickly used as a fort. And the reason they sent that flying company into San Antonio was to reinforce the small garrison at the Behar Presidio, because 1803 may stick in your mind. Spain returned Louisiana to France in 1800, and France, through the Louisiana Purchase, sold Louisiana to the United States. So now all of a sudden, Spain had the United States on its border. So it was concerned about invasion and reinforced the garrison with the Second Flying Company. Now, Second Flying Company of San Carlos de Parras is a little bit hard to say many times, so they started being called La Compañía del Alamo. Now, again, forgive me, as I've said many times on this podcast, my Spanish pronunciation is not perfect, but they would call it the Alamo Company, or simply El Alamo. And some say that's how the mission came to be known, as the Alamo. Now, when the Gutierrez-McGee expedition reached Behar in 1813, many of the company of Alamo de Parras left the Spanish army and joined the insurgent army. Well, fast forward past that, and you had the Mexican Revolution, at which point the Spanish forces became Mexican forces, and the Company of the Alamo was sent to build Fort Tenochtitlan, and Losoya was in the company at that time. Now we're in 1830, and we're in an area that is present-day Burleson County. So Losoya and his fellow members of the company are charged with building a fort. And the reason they picked this part, or this site, was that it was about halfway to Nacogdoches down the old San Antonio Road. If you're driving around in Burleson County and many other counties in that area, you'll see a state highway sign OSR, the old San Antonio Road. And where that road crossed the Brazos River on its way to Nacogdoches is the strategic site that was selected. The General Manuel de Mieri Terán was the general who selected the site. We picked a high bank on the west side of the Brazos, the high side as we call it, those of us that run around the Brazos River. And it was a very prominent site and a great spot for a fort. A community grew up around the fort, as it often does. In the city council of San Felipe de Austin, the capital of Austin's colony, the city council, called the Ayuntamiento in Spanish, decided to build a road to the fort. So it was a very important site when it was built. But for various reasons, as tension rose between settlers and the Mexican government, it was decided to evacuate the garrison out of the fort, and the fort was no longer viable. This is by 1832. However, the community, the settlement, did remain viable for many years, up till almost the Civil War. So Losoya finds himself back in Bihar. So let's trace him. Let's recap for a minute. Losoya is living in Bihar with his family. He joins the Spanish army. The Spanish army becomes the Mexican army. He ends up back in Bihar in 1832. But as you'll recall, this is the time when Santa Anna changes his mind, to put it lightly, and converts from a federalist to a dictator. So by the fall of 1835, Losoya and many others had left the Mexican army to enlist in the army that was going to oppose Santa Anna's government. So Losoya enlists in the company of Tejano rebels commanded by Juan Seguin. As events unfolded in the fall of 1835, the Losoya family had to leave their home because the structures around the Alamo became occupied by the rebel army, the Texian army, and, of course, Santa Anna heads toward San Antonio. And just as a reminder, you had the Battle of Gonzales in 1835, October 1835, the famous come and take it flag, etc. Then you had the Battle of Concepcion, and you can go back to episode 3 to learn about that important battle. Then you had the siege of Bihar in the fall and winter of 1835, where the Texians finally capture the town. And Losoya participated in the siege of Bihar in Juan Seguin's company. And after that, the area around Alamo was occupied by the Texians, and Santa Anna's on his way. Now, Juan Seguin rode away from the Alamo. He left the Alamo as a courier delivering messages from Travis, but he left some of his men behind. And Jose Toribio Losoya was one of those men. Now, Losoya's wife and 3 children, as did other civilians and relatives of the defenders at the Alamo, sought refuge in the mission, and you can understand why they'd want to be with their father and husband. You can go back to episode 12 and learn about the survivors of the Alamo. So Losoya is at this point an Alamo defender. Santa Anna lays siege to the Alamo, and the battle, of course, occurs on March 6th, 1836. Jose Toribio Losoya's body was found in the chapel of the mission and was burned with the other bodies. His wife and his 3 children, however, survived. Now, here's where it gets confusing. The Alamo and the Battle of the Alamo may be one of the most written about topics in Texas history. I am not, and do not purport to be, an Alamo scholar, although I have read most, if not all, of the Alamo books and countless articles and other sources about the Alamo. But despite all the writing and all the investigation, we still don't know for sure who was in there, who escaped, who survived. We've got a good idea, and we'll never know for sure, and that's okay. We don't have to know for sure. So I mentioned earlier, Toribio's wife is Maria. But in one account, the Losoya female surviving the Alamo is identified as Concepcion. In fact, one book says Concepcion and 1 son. Now, Toribio had 3 children that supposedly went into the Alamo for refuge. She had a sister, Toribio's wife, or Concepcion, had a sister, Juana. Juana was married to a man named Melton. Juana Melton also said to have survived the Alamo. Pick up another book, and you read the account of Enrique Esparza, who was a young child at the time of the battle. If you go back to that Survivors of the Alamo episode 12, you'll see this. Enrique Esparza gave a very well-known account of the battle November 9th, 1901. However, he was quite elderly at the time. He says Mrs. Concepcion Losoya and her 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons. Was it Maria? Was it Concepcion? These accounts will get repeated over and over by historians, so I'm not going to sit here and say we know for sure. But suffice to say, there were most likely Losoya survivors at the Alamo. For our purposes, however, Jose Toribio Losoya did not survive. He went down as a hero of the Alamo with his fellow defenders. And I want to say something about that right quick before we get to getting there. It is perfectly acceptable to refer to the defenders of the Alamo as heroes. They were. They did exactly what they said they would do in the face of certain death and fight the tyrannical army of a brutal dictator, Santa Anna. That's worth celebrating. Throughout history, there are those who will criticize the Battle of the Alamo as militarily insignificant or what have you. Fine, we can argue about that. Still others, and some fairly recent, will attempt to use the Alamo, as many have done throughout history, for their own political purposes, and attempt to tear down rather than attempt to build up. Well, you know, it's fine to have arguments about the historical significance of the battle, the ideals of the Texas Revolution, etc., etc. But it's equally acceptable, and these days I would argue more necessary than ever, to find heroes in men who will stand and fight for what they believe in. The Alamo defenders were such men. Jose Toribio Losoya was such a man. Alamo defender, Tejano hero. Well, now we come to the part of the episode I call Getting There, where I'll tell you where to go see a couple of things I talked about in the Alamo in the episode. I should not have to tell anyone listening to this podcast how to go see the Alamo. Go to San Antonio right now and go visit the Alamo. The Alamo is under renovation. The area is being redesigned and should turn out hopefully to be wonderful. There's going to be many more exhibits, more museum space. The incredible Phil Collins collection is going to be housed in a building that's under construction right now. Go there and celebrate the Alamo. If you're listening to this episode before March 6th, if you go there March 6th for Dawn at the Alamo, I guarantee you it is a special and moving experience. There is also a Losoya House exhibit there. The location where the famous 18-pound cannon that Travis fired in answer to Santa Anna's surrender demand was at the location of the Losoya house. So in the southwest corner of the original Alamo compound, so southwest of the present-day church, was the location of the Losoya house. And there's some information there about the house and a little bit about Laughing Behar, in addition to the exhibit with the cannon. It's well worth your time. And to learn more about that, go to www.thealamo.org, and you'll find a page dedicated to what they call the 18-pounder Losoya house exhibit. Well worth spending a little time there. That wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Texas. Thanks for listening today. Go find us on Twitter and Instagram at Wise About Texas. Email me, host@wiseabouttexas.com, with your own Alamo reminiscences and stories and scholarship. If you've got some, like and share the Wise About Texas Facebook page. And most importantly, remember the Alamo. Go out and do something for Texas today. Until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.